So we now know that AOC was massively exaggerated in her Instagram video where she said she was fearful for her life because the mob was coming and she thought she was going to be murdered. So I want to talk a little about what was going on and show what a hypocrite she is and the people like her, particularly on the left that we see, that want to be perpetual victims after they use rhetoric that inspires violence against the people that they oppose but take no accountability for it. So AOC gave an Instagram post that went out to hundreds of thousands of people where she got teary and said that she feared for her life during the January 6th Capitol attacks. We now know that she wasn't even in the Capitol. Now, she's out there trying to censor stories or getting her fans to flag people on Twitter that bring this up because she says that this is an untruth and that we're spreading misinformation. But if you look, it's totally true. She was in a building across from the Capitol. Let me first say this. I'm sure AOC and the other politicians were scared, and I'm not trying to downplay the fact that it's scary when there's mob violence. But she made it seem as if the mob was bearing down on her, and the mob never even entered the building she was in. She says, well, it was connected to the Capitol by tunnels. But there's video that you can see other people took live while they were being evacuated from those tunnels in her building, and no one's frightened whatsoever. They're just sort of milling about, waiting in line for their time to get out. So why is it that AOC was the only one apparently in that crowd that felt that she feared for her life? Then we find out, in addition to there not being any rioters there, the person that AOC was afraid of was actually a police officer that was trying to help her. She said that he sounded gruff or his rhetoric sounded weird. And when she was started to get called out for this, she claimed, I was a sexual assault victim when I was younger, and somehow this triggered that event. Well, what does this have to do with besmirching the police officer that was trying to help them? And the fact is this, she's using this in order to play the victim so she could go after people. And this is what's particularly shameful. Yes, I'm sure anyone who's been around mob violence was fearful. But that doesn't mean you get to call your colleagues would-be murderers like she called Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz wanted to see an audit of election results and wasn't going to vote to support the electors. That's not a murderous position. That's not a position that led to insurrection. That's just his opinion and something that I tend to agree with, that we should have saw that audit. That doesn't mean that he called for violence. And AOC implying that not only did he call for violence, but that he was calling for her murder is incredibly heinous. Now, it's particularly heinous when you look at the rhetoric that AOC's used all spring and summer when it comes to the George Floyd riots and the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots. Although she's once or twice said, oh, I'm not condoning violence, she continued to call to make people uncomfortable. She called for unrest to continue. What does she think this means in the context of what we saw happening every day? We saw a Chaz zone in Seattle. We saw people in D.C. trying to break into the White House and presumably remove and harm Donald Trump. We saw countless cities have small sections of them on fire, businesses looted, people's homes burned. We saw people dying. And meanwhile, while this is all going on, AOC is calling for, quote, continued unrest. Now, Ted Cruz never called for unrest. Ted Cruz never called for anyone to get in the faces of his Democratic colleagues like you see Democrats like Maxine Waters claiming. Yet he's called a murder. The lack of self-awareness is indicative of what you see from these people that want to be perpetual victims, particularly on the left. She calls for unrest and things like that, knowing that other people must have been fearful for the mob. Doesn't she think that as people saw their buildings being looted and buildings across the street being burned, that other people all summer were worried, my God, I could be next, I could be killed? Unlike her, they didn't have capital city police officers to protect them. And yet she continued to call for unrest. It's only when she's affected that all of a sudden it becomes a big deal. So to heck with all those regular people. And then if we're going to say that it only matters when it happens to politicians, remember when Rand Paul and his wife were leaving a Trump rally in D.C. and they actually were accosted by a mob, unlike AOC, and were fearful, as Rand Paul's wife said, she was fearful that they would be injured or fearful for her life. Where was AOC condemning this? Where was AOC calling Democrats like herself that used the rhetoric that these people attacking Rand Paul and his wife were espousing? Where was she calling those Democrats murderers? Instead, she says nothing. I'm sick and tired of this hyperbolic victimhood claiming that you could then use to shove down policies down people's throat. She's exaggerating. She had every right to be fearful, but the fact that she's calling people murderers because she disagrees with them politically, and she hasn't acknowledged, geez, maybe when I was spurring on the mobs or ignorant of them all summer, people felt like I felt that day in the Capitol. They don't got a platform to go on and exaggerate and talk about how their political whims should be achieved because they were fearful of their life. So I think we shouldn't use the Rob North standard. We should use the AOC standard. If AOC is going to demand people be removed from Congress because they shared political beliefs that some of the people that were in a mob, by the way, that wasn't in AOC's building, if they should be removed from office or impeached or be investigated criminally, or they're called murderers, I think AOC is a murderer. She should be immediately impeached and removed. She called for unrest while these mobs were chasing people, and these people were actually experiencing, their buildings were actually being looted. The mobs were actually at their buildings. They didn't have to make it up like AOC. So, according to the standard of AOC, she should immediately be removed from office. Republicans should call for her impeachment immediately, and she should be called a murderer because that's the standard she issued to Republicans like Ted Cruz. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I'm going to be on some new platforms. This video will be the first uploaded to them, so it'll be things like Gab, Odyssey, Rumble, Locals. So I'll have a link in the description of all the places you can follow me. Consider subscribing to me on Subscribestar, which I have a new account. Donations are always appreciated. And if you like this video, please share it with other people. Thanks so much, and as always, have a good one.